results from a Chocolatier's ERP lawsuits, trends in AI adoption, and lessons from ERP failure. Those are just a few of the topics we're going to cover here in episode 169 of Transformation Ground Control.
Welcome to Transformation Ground Control. Ground Control. The podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. This podcast features technology agnostic and international discussions related to digital strategy, software selection, implementation, change management, business process optimization, and everything else you need to know to make your digital transformation project successful. Whether you're embarking on an ERP implementation, supply chain transformation, or any other business or digital transformation, this podcast is for you. Now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 169. My name's Eric Kimberling, here with Darian Chwialkowski. Darian, thanks for joining today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Excited to have the audience here today. This is the podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation, including the people, process, technology, and strategy sides of transformation. Got a lot we're going to cover here today. We are going to cover the results from a recent lawsuit involving a chocolatier that is not Hershey's. Hershey's is well known for their ERP failure years ago, but another chocolatier has had a recent lawsuit, and we'll share the results of that lawsuit here in a moment. We're going to talk about some trends in actual AI adoption, how much organizations are actually using AI at the moment. We're going to have Scott Janke on the show later. He's a director at Third Stage Consulting. He's going to be on talking about lessons from ERP failure. And then later in the show, we're going to get into the digital transformation blame game. We're going to talk about both sides of blame, both implementer and customer. Whose fault is it, or what are the things that each party tends to do that oftentimes contribute to failure? And we'll unpack that here later in this episode. But before we jump into some of these topics, you can find new episodes of the show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can find past episodes and keep up with current episodes at transformationgroundcontrol.com. And look forward to hearing your feedback on that. So before we get into our topics here, though, today, Darian, you've got some questions and comments from social media we want to get to.
Yeah, so recently Eric posted a video on YouTube named The Death of Cloud Software, and people had a lot to say about that. So we have some interesting questions and comments today from that specific, whether it was on TikTok or YouTube. So the first one is, cloud vendors are locking in their customer base with startup discounts and other. They know very well once you have moved and adapted, there's no turning back. Cost savings is a non-issue, and they can at some point increase what they charge. ... Now what? Question mark.
Right. No, it's a really good point, and I think it's a rhetorical question, and I don't have a good answer for it, because I think the point here is that it is true. You know, when you move all of your applications, all your data, all of your operations to a cloud solution, you are creating a vendor lock-in situation. And you just have to be aware of that you've lost a lot of leverage now. And it's a lot different than in the past, where you had on-prem systems that you kind of own the software and you still had a certain amount of control over it. You could do whatever you wanted with it. Now, for better or for worse, mostly for better, but there is some worse to it. Organizations are finding that now we're stuck with this vendor, and it is a great question. Now what? You know, if you decide that this vendor's not working out for you, or the product's not exactly what you need, or your business changes over time, which inevitably will happen, then the question becomes, how do we move and migrate our entire operations, all of our data, out of one cloud environment into a new one? And that suddenly gets a little bit more complicated than it might have been in the past.
Right. Yeah, it's super interesting to think about. We also had some questions really disagreeing with you. So some of them was, on-prem has subscription costs called hiring workers to maintain, LOL. The best thing about the cloud is you pay for what you use. The worst thing about the cloud is you pay for what you use. So we had some different I guess that one's more agreeing with you than anything. But the other one was like, we had a lot of questions talking about, but you have to hire workers to maintain, and you have to pay the bill if you want to have it on-prem, like the electricity bill or whatever else. So what is your comments, I guess, to that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I don't think cloud is going anywhere. Obviously, it's a dramatic title by, the thumbnail says the death of cloud ERP software. And it's more sort of trying to expose the downside risks. And I'm not by any means suggesting that cloud is going to go away, because it's just not. There's too much money at stake, and software vendors are all in on the cloud. So whether we like it or not, or even if a company or even if I didn't like cloud, it doesn't really matter, because that's where we're going. But it's really interesting to me how there's a lot of cloud purists that don't want to discuss the downside. And that's really the whole point of what I'm trying to expose in that video. Is there's a lot of benefits to cloud, and in the video I do talk about what some of the benefits are, but there's also risks, and those risks don't get highlighted enough. And if I'm a software vendor, or if I'm a sales rep that sells cloud software, I might disagree with me as well, because I don't want to hear it. I don't want that message getting out there, because it undermines my ability to sell, or the advantages I'm trying to sell. But no, I think the point though is that there are ongoing costs with on-premise for sure. I think the one comment is a really good one, that you may not have the ongoing subscription cost per se that's going to a vendor. You might have just one capital cost or one capital outlay up front, and then a smaller ongoing maintenance to the vendor. That number may be lower for on-prem, but to this person's point, if you have to hire 2 or 3 people or whatever it is to maintain the system, that's a cost that you've got to factor in as well. And for some organizations, that right there could be enough to justify moving to the cloud. The only problem, though, that we often see is that you could say, I've got, say, 3 full-time people supporting my old legacy system, but most organizations don't actually reduce that cost. They end up saying, well, we're going to move to the cloud. We could save these 3 bodies, but we're not going to do anything about it. We're going to keep those 3 bodies to do something else. And so they end up not realizing that as a real benefit. So in theory, yes, it could deliver some value or some lower cost savings if you don't have some of that full-time support to support your old system. But for a lot of organizations, they don't actually follow through on it. But if you do follow through on it, then yes, that could definitely be a net gain that could further underscore the benefit of cloud technologies.
Yeah, it's super interesting to hear some more of the negatives, I guess you could say, of the cloud technologies, because I think that's something that, you're right, we don't hear very often and isn't really talked about. It's all about, okay, everybody's moving to the cloud, so what do you need to do to get there? So it's really interesting, and I think a good perspective for a lot of people to hear. Yeah,
and it's interesting because I think last week's episode I talked about how I had some we've had so many questions and comments from that one video that was posted a couple weeks ago, but I covered a couple of comments last week as well from that same video. And what I mentioned in last week's episode when I was doing that is that I posted a similar video years ago, probably 5 years ago. It was either a blog or a video, and I just remember getting roasted pretty badly at the time. And I still do get roasted for saying the stuff I say a lot of the times, because it doesn't fit the industry norms and the carefully fine-tuned marketing messaging that the vendors want to have out there. So I do get roasted a fair amount, but I didn't get roasted nearly as much this time as I did 5 years ago, which I find really interesting. I feel like people are finally recognizing that, oh, yes, lots of value to the cloud, but yes, there are downside risks as well. And that's all we want to do, is just make sure that people open up their eyes to, like, yeah, you're going to the cloud, great, you're going to save some money, there's some value there, but just be aware that there's also a dark side, and you've got to manage to that. And that's really the whole point here, is just to manage that risk, just like you do anything else in business.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm really excited to get into our newsworthy articles today.
Yes, absolutely. We're going to do that here in a second. Let's come back to that here. We'll take a quick break. We're going to come back and talk about Russell Stover and some other chocolatiers recently had a lawsuit involving their ERP implementation. We're going to talk about that and the outcome of that. We're going to talk about AI adoption and the actual adoption of AI technologies among enterprises. And later in the show, we'll have Scott Janke on the show, who's a director at Third Stage Consulting. He's going to be on joining me to talk about lessons from ERP failures and lawsuits. And then later in the show, after Scott is on, we'll talk about the digital transformation blame game. Whose fault is it when a project has trouble? So we're going to get to all this stuff here in just a moment. But first, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology-agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 169. My name is Eric Kimberling, here with Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com, and you can also subscribe on various platforms by going to that website as well, transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can also view all the past episodes. So I'm excited for some of these newsworthy topics you've got in store for us, Darian. What have you got related to this, to the Chocolatier lawsuit debacle?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting one. I feel like we don't get to talk about this a lot, but Arnold and Porter won a $33.45 million jury verdict for Lind, Gardali, Russell, and Stover against GXO Logistics over a failed warehouse software implementation. The trial in Missouri ended with GXO found liable on multiple counts, including fraudulent and negligent misrepresentation of and breach of contract. The chocolate companies were awarded full damages and successfully defended against GXO's $12 million counterclaims. Additional legal relief is also being pursued in this situation. Eric, this is something really interesting that we don't get to talk about a lot on here. I mean, later you and Scott will definitely get into this more, but can you give us context as somebody who is an expert witness on the size of the lawsuit, and is this something you see very often on how big it was, or would you say this is a pretty average lawsuit?
No, it's pretty big. I mean, we're dealing with tens of millions of dollars of claims here and money at stake. It's definitely a bigger one. The biggest one I've seen was, I think it was right around 900 million at stake, where a large company sued one of the big ERP vendors for close to $1 billion. And what they did though is they factored in not just the cost of the implementation, but then the business impact it had on their operations. They lost business, they lost revenue allegedly, and that was sort of their allegation. So it's not the biggest one I've ever seen, but it's definitely on the bigger side, and it just goes to show how much is at stake. And this is just, keep in mind, that's just a warehouse management system, which I don't want to be dismissive of that, but that's smaller in scope than some of these big ERP projects where they're trying to automate everything across the entire business, not just the warehouse. So you can imagine if that would have been a full-blown ERP project, what those damages might have been. It probably would have been even higher in that case.
Yeah, definitely interesting. Also, do you think there's anything that, I don't know how much you have read up on this particular case, but do you think there's anything they could have done before getting to this point of suing? I know this is something that you and Scott obviously are going to talk about later, but in this specific case?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot you can do, and we will talk about that here in a moment when Scott joins us to talk about lessons from some of these lawsuits and failures. And in fact, that's one of the questions I want to ask him is, what can you do to stay out of court? That's one of the questions I'll ask him. But, generally speaking, without giving away too much of what we'll get into here in the interview, generally speaking, I mean, in my opinion, there's really no reason why a project should ever get to the lawsuit stage. I mean, if you've let it go that long, something's really wrong. I mean, you should have the right controls in place where you shut things down or you pause things or you pivot or whatever you need to do well before you get to the lawsuit stage. And I hate to say it, and it might be used against me someday if attorneys listen to this comment, in which they will. A lot of times you have to look at the organization and say, why did they wait that long, before things got that bad, before they made a change themselves? And I think what happens is there's sort of a learned helplessness that comes with these projects, unfortunately, where organizations think, well, we're not the experts. We don't do this every day, so we're going to hire the experts, which makes sense. You want to hire experts to help you through the project, but they end up taking sort of a hands-off approach a lot of times as a result of that. And so they turn to their software vendor and say, we just trust you to just do it. We're just going to kind of wipe our hands clean, and then you're going to go take care of it for us. And the organization oftentimes doesn't have the right oversight and the right controls in place. And then things get way off track. And then all of a sudden executives look up and say, wait, what's going on here? This is a total disaster and a train wreck. And then someone decides to sue over it. And the point is, there should be more governance and oversight and involvement to where you see it coming and that you can adjust and make drastic decisions that might help you avoid the failure later on. But unfortunately, organizations also don't want to make tough decisions. Like sometimes you have to fire your system integrator. Sometimes you have to replace your team, or sometimes you have to cut scope or take longer than you originally planned. I mean, there's tough decisions you have to make, and that's why strong leadership is so important in these sorts of projects.
Right. And when it gets to that point of them having to maybe switch their team or fire some sort of team, when do they know they are at that point? Like, what are some signs, I guess, that a company could recognize?
Well, the first thing I look for is if your team doesn't really know what's going on in the project, and they don't really know why you've got 50 people from the outside consulting firm on the project or whatever it is. If you just don't have any idea what these consultants are doing, or if they're doing way too much of the work, like 90% of the work, and your team's only doing a small subset of the work, those are early warning indicators that something's wrong. That's not going to go well. It just never does. So that's one thing you have to, warning sign, I guess, that you would watch for. And then, of course, if you see that the project's getting behind schedule and you're spending more than you expected, that of course is a red flag as well. So there's a lot of them that we'll dive into with Scott as well, but those are a couple that come to mind.
Yeah, I'm excited to get further into this conversation with Scott. I think he has a lot of good insight into expert witness cases. So that'll be really interesting. But for now, I want to move to our second article that is also really interesting. I know on this podcast, we talk a lot about different companies that are implementing AI and all the exciting things that are happening with AI. But recently, the U.S. Census Bureau did a survey, and they found that only 5.4% of all large companies in the U.S. are actually implementing and using AI to the capabilities that it's able to use it for. Large businesses in particular are very cautious about these security risks, and many are prioritizing data and risk management over quick adoption of AI. Eric, I'm interested to get your opinion on this, whether you think this will come back to bite some of these large companies like in the butt later on. If other companies, maybe their competitors, are implementing AI now, will those companies be further ahead, or is it good to be cautious and do a slow adoption process of AI?
Well, I think it's good to be cautious in many cases. I think, first of all, just going head first into any sort of technology without having a clear vision of what it is you want out of it and how you're going to use it in your organization, that's generally not a good idea to begin with. And you have to be careful with AI because it's so easy for people just to pick it up and run with it. You and I can get on ChatGPT right now. You and I both use ChatGPT in our day-to-day jobs. And so can everyone in any organization. And you have to be careful, not that you don't want people to figure out their own innovative ways to be efficient, but you also need to kind of paint that roadmap or that vision of how technology can be used throughout the organization, just to create that commonality. But the other probably bigger issue that I see with AI is just protection of data and confidential information. So when you start feeding an AI model of any sort confidential information, it becomes part of that learned algorithm. And so you're sort of giving up a certain amount of confidentiality and a certain amount of your intellectual property if you start sharing a lot of information with any sort of open AI model in particular. So yeah, I think it's I love AI. I think it's super cool. I try to use it as much as I can. I know you use it a lot too. Organizations have a lot to gain from it, but I think you also have to be really careful, and especially with privacy and data privacy laws throughout the world. You just have to be aware of those regulations and the need to protect your own intellectual property as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I know that's something that we also have talked about a lot too, is when is there going to be like some law that comes into place for production for your data or for your information with AI, and what does that look like in the future? That's something that I think will be really interesting to watch develop over the next few years, especially with how rapidly AI is developing. But I think it'll be also interesting to see once a law gets placed, or if it does, how much faster companies start to adopt AI. Do you think that if something like that were to pass, I guess, would you at least think companies would adopt it a little bit faster?
Yeah, I think potentially, but I think there's also a certain amount of not unknownness. I'm not sure what the right word is I'm looking for, but just unfamiliarity or lack of awareness on, how exactly AI can be used and how it can benefit organizations. I think it's the good news is it's just like a wide open field of opportunity, and that can be overwhelming to organizations. So I think just sort of creating that clarity, that will help speed up adoption as well. If we start laying out specific use cases of where we can be using AI in our organizations, that's just going to give people more direction rather than sort of a random haphazard approach to trying out new technologies.
Right. It kind of relates back to, I know we talked about this maybe a couple weeks ago, but if you're just skipping over the phase 0 and just implementing something without actually knowing, then it's not the best situation maybe for your company. Is that what you're kind of saying here, I guess, in a way?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Super interesting stuff. Always love hearing about what news articles are out there currently. So I love diving into these different topics, but I'm super excited to get back into the expert witness stuff with Scott. Like I said, I think he has a lot of good information and expertise that he can share with everybody.
Yeah, Scott is one of the pivotal people on our expert witness team here at Third Stage Consulting. He's going to explain what an expert witness is and what some of the lessons are from having supported various ERP lawsuits throughout the world as expert witnesses. So we're going to get into that really interesting conversation here in just a moment. We'll have Scott Janke. He's a director of Third Stage Consulting, and he'll be on the show to talk about that with me. And then we're also going to get into the digital transformation blame game later in the show as well, so stick around for that. We've got a lot more to cover, so be sure to stick around. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control. I recently published my first book. It's called The Final Countdown, Strategies to Reach the Third Stage of Digital Transformation. And I wrote this book because I really wanted to find a concise way to share some of my knowledge around digital strategy and how to get started on a digital transformation journey. So in this book, I cover 3 different sections. I cover the people, process, and technology aspects of transformation, with the idea that it's meant to be a starting point, a launching pad for organizations and team members that are going through digital transformations. So I encourage you to buy this book. You can get it electronically, you can get it paperback, or you can get it in hard copy as I'm holding here in front of you. You can get it by going to thefinalcountdown.com. You can also search for it on Amazon if you shop at Amazon. Otherwise, just go to thefinalcountdown.com. Love to hear your feedback on this book as well. So I hope you check it out and hope you enjoy.
I'm excited to share our newly released 2024 Digital Enterprise Operations Report. This free download is available on the Third Stage website at thirdstage-consulting.com. This report is truly packed full of technology-independent and agnostic insights for your project to ensure that you're strategically optimized for success. Download your copy today with the QR code in front of me or visit our website for more details.
These things take time, mom and dad, they have a good life. But what am I gonna do with mine?
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 169. Thank you for joining here today. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And one of the services we provide our clients, among others, is expert witness work. And expert witness work involves supporting lawsuits. So when there's a lawsuit that involves ERP implementations or digital transformations, lawyers will contact us to be the expert witnesses. We'll analyze the case and figure out what went wrong. And ultimately the lawyers fight over, whose fault it is, and they battle each other over, oftentimes, as we discussed earlier today, millions or tens of millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars at stake. So there's some good lessons from these lawsuits too. And I love doing this expert witness work because it keeps us as consultants fresh in terms of understanding what goes wrong in these projects. And it helps us take some of these lessons and apply them to our consulting practices that don't involve expert witness work. So in other words, when we're helping clients start to implement technology from the beginning, we can help them avoid some of these mistakes. So what better way to learn from it and share it with the audience here today than to have one of our other expert witnesses on the show here with me today. And that is Scott Janke, Dr. Scott Janke, more specifically, who's a PhD. He is also a director of strategy and transformation here at Third Stage Consulting Group based out of our U.S. office. So with all that being said, Scott, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, I appreciate the invite.
Yeah, this will be a fun conversation. And before I dive into some of the tricky questions I have for you today, what can you tell me about your background, about you and your background?
Yeah, funny enough, I never thought I'd work in technology. I was a business major as an undergrad, but was fortunate enough to join the computer science or computer center at the White House, my first job out of college. So I worked there for about 3 years and then spent really the next 25 years in consulting and operational roles. I got my teeth in consulting with Deloitte and KPMG, obviously a lot of global projects on those kind of engagements through those firms. And subsequently, as you mentioned, PhD, I've earned my doctorate in IT management, focusing on the acceptance of technology. And I'll talk about how that influences, I think, some of our work that we do with our clients in and outside of expert witness. And also leverage that, ran a STEM management science master's program at UT Dallas for a few years and before joining Third Stage.
Great. So you've got quite the experience that runs the gamut of consulting, academia, and stuff in between. So
the trifecta.
Trifecta, yes. So good stuff. Well, I guess just for the audience's sake, just to help understand what exactly an expert witness is and what it does, can you just explain the whole concept of what an expert witness is to start?
Yeah, I will. Obviously, anyone can Google what the definition is. But from our perspective, when we're hired as an expert witness in a litigation, regardless of the party that we represent, really coming to the table and leveraging all our experience, both theoretical and practical, from an impartial standpoint. And I say that specifically because regardless of who we're representing in the litigation case, we come into it looking as a neutral party and following the breadcrumbs from the beginning of the project to where it actually became a legal case. So we actually look at this from a neutral, impartial, as I mentioned, perspective of understanding truly what is happening across, whether it's the software vendor, the system integrator, even the client, where things kind of started falling apart, and providing, again, our expertise in working with clients today from a live perspective. We actually do quite a few assessment cases as well. Clients will hire us midstream when they start getting a sense that a project is off the rails. And we follow very much the same effort. Those tend to be 2 to 3 months. Litigations can be years. So the duration is really different. But ultimately, we kind of still look at the trail of the breadcrumbs from the beginning to the end. and really understanding from our perspective, collective perspectives being a client as well as consulting firm, where things again started going off the track.
Right. So in these cases, you typically have a plaintiff, of course, that is typically, and not always, but typically it's the company that was implementing technology, that the end customer is typically the plaintiff, and they're suing typically either the software vendor and or the party that implemented the software,
Right.
and that's the defendant in most cases. Sometimes the software vendor will end up suing or countersuing the plaintiff. But when we're looking at these cases where company fails in their implementation, they sue software vendor and or system integrator or implementer, who's well, first of all, who do we typically represent? Our team, or which side
Most
are we
often
on?
it's the client, the entity that actually secured the software, secured the SI, and is one paying the bill for the implementation is typically the one that feels the brunt of a project that has failed either at the beginning or at the end.
Right. And of course, there are times where software vendor or system integrator hires us as well to be on the defense.
Sure.
But it does seem like over the years, I don't know why this is, but it seems like it's sort of trended the direction you're talking, which is more the end customer that ends
Right.
up being the side that more commonly hires us. But when we're looking at these cases, then you've got the side that we're on, which is typically the plaintiff, but not always. And then you've got the defense, typically the software vendor, not always. Whose fault is it typically when we're doing these cases?
And it's interesting when we start having conversation with the legal team, the attorneys that are actually ultimately the group that hire us on their client's behalf. We have a level set up front that we're going to look at this, as I mentioned earlier, in an impartial, unbiased view. And so far, in my experience as being part of the expert witness cases that we've worked on in the past, rarely is one party 100% at fault. And we set that tone up front. There is quite a bit of fault on the client side, on the plaintiff side, when a lack of understanding of what this kind of project is going to happen, lack of oversight of the SI. So we look at this again from an impartial perspective, but typically we see the burden is on the vendor side. They're the experts. That's why they were hired. The contract is being paid by the client. So it's really the burden of success falls on the technology team that's hired. Again, that's the expertise that the client is looking for. Again, there's a number of fingers to point on the client on the plaintiff side as well. But typically what we see is the rigor and the approach of how the implementation is progressing is really on the vendor side to get it right and declare any kind of issues or risks along the way so that it never gets to litigation in the first place.
Right. Yeah. That's a good overview. And, I remember my first expert witness case. I didn't even know what an expert witness was. I kind of knew, I've watched TV and have seen the concept of expert witness, but I didn't really know what expert witness meant in the context of our industry. And I remember it was the waste management versus SAP case. This was probably 15 or 17 years ago when that lawsuit happened. And that was the first time I had ever done expert witness work. It was about 15 years ago when those attorneys contacted me for that case. And so for me, that was a really memorable one because I got to learn what an expert witness was while I was being an expert witness on one of the most publicized failures in recent memory. But from your perspective, without mentioning names necessarily, can you describe the biggest or the most complex or the most memorable expert witness case that you've been involved with so far?
Yeah, and appreciate that question. It's interesting because I look through all the cases that we've worked on in the past, regardless of industry, whether it's retail, manufacturing, distribution. The challenges come up, again, not speaking names, but of course, many of the software platforms were the large ones, SAP, Oracle, and the like. What really becomes a challenge and issue around the complexity is those clients that have spent 20, 30 years developing proprietary software. They haven't really gone out to the market and looked at off-the-shelf systems, especially at the scale of an ERP or other enterprise systems. And they get into the process of, I want the new system that is multi-tenant in the cloud. Functionality is kind of homogeneous at some level. And I want the system to do exactly what we did internally from a developed system for 30 years, day one, and I don't want any customization. And so the complexity of some of these cases, we had a retailer, they manufacture but also distribute other products, where they would look at outgoing shipments, and we're talking thousands of shipments a day out of their manufacturing and distribution center, and they would reset who gets that product on a daily basis. So the complexity of how to release product back into inventory, allocate that inventory to the highest priority customers that day, and then assign the product that may have been part of a previous order the day before, gets reassigned to a new order because that customer is more important to them. And to do that at the scale that multi-billion-dollar company, most out-of-the-box, off-the-shelf systems can't handle that kind of processing. So we can talk about some of the challenges of why that project even got to that state. But really the complexity comes from those individuals, those clients that have developed their own software. So it's very unique to them, or they have never really done something like this before. And so the complexity isn't just the technology, but the project itself. And in one of the cases, and I'm sure we'll get into it today, one of the challenges, and we see this happening often with the client side, the most often the plaintiff client, is the fact that they turn the keys of the implementation over to the system integrator. They don't know this. They don't understand what's going on. Here, make us happy. And that generally starts the process of disconnect around the phases of the project. And that's usually when there's issues of delay in the project, overruns on budget that come around. But really, it's the sophistication of the homegrown systems, regardless of the industry, that really trips up a lot of outside system integrators and software vendors from our perspective.
I'm here, Scott Janke, talking about lessons from ERP failures. We've got a lot more to cover, but first we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to get to some more questions here in just a moment. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control. People oftentimes ask me how I built such a strong social media following on YouTube and LinkedIn and Facebook and other outlets. And the fact of the matter is it took me a long time to build a following through a lot of trial and error, making a lot of mistakes. Had I known that there were companies out there that could help me build my brand, I would have done that a long time ago. I didn't know that, but the good news is that there is today a consulting firm that will help you through building your own personal brand through some of their training programs. The company is called Roll-Off Consulting, and if you're familiar with Emma Roll-Off, she's someone that I've had on this podcast before, and she's well known in the digital transformation space as well as the sales space, and she's big on TikTok, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And she and her husband have started a training course and a training company that focuses on helping people build their personal brands and helping them to sell themselves digitally. So whether you're a salesperson that's trying to reach more customers or you're an individual that's just trying to build your personal brand, that's something that they help with through their training programs. And they've offered listeners of this podcast a free 5-day LinkedIn challenge. And I encourage you to check it out. I've included a link below for this podcast. If you go to the podcast notes, you'll find a link that gets you free access to this 5-day challenge where you'll get step-by-step guidance. You'll get real results. So you'll get some tangible results from the program. And you also get a special offer at the end of it. So it's exclusive to listeners of this podcast. Be sure to check out the link below if you want to work on building your personal brand, or if you're in sales and you're trying to reach more people. Whatever the case may be, check it out. It's free to listeners of this podcast. You can check it out via the link below.
Interested in working for a company that truly values your unique skills and experience? Here at Third Stage, we don't hire based on resumes alone. We look at the full candidate, experience, and willingness to provide excellent service for our clients. Within a technology, independent, and agnostic consulting firm, you have the opportunity to learn across industries with a diverse group of clients. Our consultants also have the opportunity to diversify their portfolio and learn across technology systems. If you're interested in joining a high-growth entrepreneurial organization, please reach out to us at work@thirdstage-consulting.com.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 169. My name is Eric Kimberling here with Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday and also past episodes of the show by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. I'm here with Scott Janke, and we're talking about lessons from ERP implementation failures. Every business has their complexities, but there's some obviously that have more complexities than others. And it's always interesting when we're in these cases, or when we analyze these cases. One thing that you alluded to is you get to do that forensic analysis where you get to see every single artifact and every single email, every single piece of documented proof that this implementation ever happened. We get to see that. So every email that is exchanged, all the sales presentations, the contracts, the status reports from the project, the steering committee presentations.
Right.
We look at all that stuff, and you typically see, the discussions that lead up to that discussion around complexity and that sort of thing. And one of the things that's really interesting in these cases, a lot of times software vendors will say, well, you're too complicated. Just use the software the way we built it, and that'll make things less complex. But it's not always that easy, as we saw with that case you just mentioned, the manufacturer and distribution company. You can't just change that overnight, a way that a company's been doing business for decades or sometimes longer. So that's super interesting.
Well, an interesting point to call out is we get called in because the quote unquote implementation has failed. But we almost always start our assessment projects, as obviously our legal expert witness cases as well, is how the project got started during the selection phase. Typically, we see that it's really the ambiguity, the soft approach during the sales cycle and the selection process that really starts this project off on the wrong foot. The challenges of seeing this wonderful stuff at a conference, having more demos of fixed functionality, and then just doing a lot of head nods and agreement that, oh yeah, your unique processes, we can handle that. Don't worry about that. And then they go off and secure a 5-7 year contract on licenses, a 5-year implementation, and then get into very loose requirements. And then the implementation, again, as I mentioned, starts off on a very poor setting. So rarely is the implementation itself the failure. It usually is indicative of how the sales cycle and the selection worked in the first place. And to that point, when we get hired, Third Stage gets hired to do system selections, we rarely start looking at, these are the systems we would recommend right up front, right? It's more about what is unique to you. A lot of these, again, multi-tenant SaaS ERP enterprise solutions are meant to be used out of the box. And many of the functional areas of these ERPs are just that. They're blocking and tackling, financial, accounting, procurement. Those tend to be competitive advantage for our clients, right? So we want to really focus on, during the selection phase, what's unique about you. What are those processes of that functionality that you will not use out of the box? And that's usually when we start figuring out what is that smaller pool of systems that could be worked in that environment. Rarely is, again, I mentioned the blocking and tackling, right? How do you receive shipments? Typically is not a competitive advantage for our clients. It's more about, as I mentioned, that other legal case, how product is assigned to an order and shipped out, how they deal with customers from a CRM configuration effort. Those are ones that are the tricky ones. Everything else that a lot of the ERP platforms support are just that, just basic platform foundational functional areas that aren't a competitive advantage. So those areas tend not to be tripped up in a implementation that goes south.
Right. Yeah, great points. And I want to turn to the audience too, just to acknowledge where people are joining from today. Deb is joining from Toronto today. Maurice from Netherlands, thank you for being here, Maurice. Carmen from Sydney, Australia, thank you for being here. Alcinda from Johannesburg, South Africa. Fuad from Brunei. We had a client in Brunei not too long ago, so good to have you here, Fuad. And then Jezree from Toronto. So we've got a large Canadian contingency here today, among other countries. So thank you all for being here. And again, if you have any questions for Scott and I as we're going through the conversation, please drop those in the chat. We're watching the stream from all the different platforms here today. And I'll keep asking my questions, and then eventually we'll get to the audience questions here as they start to roll in. And you started to allude to this a little bit, Scott. You started talking about complexities and of a client's business, and you talked about outsourcing to a system integrator and how that can lead to challenges. And you started to allude to this a little bit, but if we were just to back up for a second and say, what are the, regardless of whose fault it is in these cases, when we're analyzing the cases and we're testifying in court and doing our analysis there, what are some of the root causes? Like if you were to summarize, the patterns that are pretty common in these different expert witness cases and or situations where we go into a client and help them get a project back on track because it's failed, and maybe it's not a lawsuit yet, but they'll hire us to come in and basically recover the project. In both sets of clients that you've been involved with, what would you say are sort of the major patterns or themes that contribute to the failure in general?
And we may talk about this later, but we don't typically see the technology itself as a key point of friction. Most of the systems that get selected can handle 99% of everything that a company wants it to do, with a few tweaks here and there. And having taught undergraduate and graduate classes in project management, it's interesting that some of these complex multi-million-dollar projects come down to the fundamentals of how a project should be run. Almost every client wants to get the system live as fast as possible. They skip the most important point or phase of the project. It's the planning, and making sure that what is the definition of success, right? What are we actually expected to achieve at the end of this project? Making sure that you have a feasible pace of the project. Many times they want to replace legacy systems plus process changes plus new functionality they don't have. And even at the very beginning, that's a 3+ year project. Well, I don't know what's going to happen next week, but I promise it's going to be different than what I'm thinking. But if you plan out a 3-year project, expect that it's going to take a lot of different left turns. And so the longer the project, the less likely you're going to stay on track. If you go into it with too much expectation, you put too much on the plate of the system integrator and your own team, likely to be a failure. But it's interesting that even in the world of agile methodology, and a lot of software development firms want to use that concept, it doesn't mean there shouldn't still be rigor. And one thing that we find, even when clients hire us to help from a PMO standpoint on an active project, very little documentation and very little updating of that documentation is our first big sign that something is wrong. Because if we get onboarded on a new project, in fact, we have an active project right now. It's a global multi-year, multi-million-dollar project. And we come in, the easiest thing for us to assess is give us all your documentation of where you are today. And if the answer is, well, we don't have too much documentation, or here's a document, we created it 2 years ago, we just haven't updated it yet, is our first big indication that something's off already. Because there's no way that the client team, the system integrator really understands where you are in the project and what, again, that end state is. I think that clients that don't have the expertise in this area still tend to want to engage with the system integrator directly. And you're at a disadvantage at that point if you don't really know how to implement an enterprise system. And yet you're hiring somebody that is the software vendor sometimes themselves to run it entirely. It tends to create problems of accountability. And we talk about this a lot in project management, of traceability of the project. So what was the original intent of the project? What was identified as requirements and approved by all parties at the beginning of the project? How does it move through configuration, testing, and deployment with test scripts and test scenarios and user stories? There isn't many times a traceability from the beginning and end that's easy for somebody like us, if we're hired midstream, to understand where we are. And so when we get hired as a legal expert, the first thing we ask the legal team is give us access to all, as you mentioned, videos, demos, documents, whatever it is. And if we get started in that, and it's very hard to start piecing things together, even at the very beginning, the hair on the back of our neck starts raising because it's just difficult for anyone in a big enterprise system to be able to understand where things are in flight if things aren't properly documented around the way. And I speak about this a lot to our clients, is that rarely is one methodology, waterfall or agile, ideal for a enterprise system. It's usually a hybrid form. But the problem is a lot of technology firms that implement systems use this concept of agile to get away from being required to document a lot of stuff. And that's a problem.
Yeah. I think in the spirit of agile, of moving fast and not slowing things down, not having a lot of red tape on your project, in that intent, a lot of times what happens is you end up with a lack of direction, and the project ends up going off the rails because you don't have clarity and documentation and alignment on what exactly it is we're trying to build.
Right.
What's always interesting is when attorneys first contact us, a lot of times what they say is, hey, we want to hire an expert like Third Stage to come in and really analyze the code. A lot of times that's what the lawyers will say, hey, we want to analyze the code and really get in and show how it was a basically poor workmanship in the way that the software was built and deployed. And usually what happens is you start asking why. Like, why do you want to look at the code? Because usually, that's not going to be a winning argument. Typically in cases like these, it's going to be, to your point, all the other stuff. It's going to be the way the project was managed, the way you aligned the business processes or not with the software, and vice versa. And usually the software itself, quote unquote, works, but it doesn't work for the business. And that's usually where the rub is, or where the challenge is.
We do occasionally get a legal expert, or expert witness case where the software vendor oversold what the platform can do at day one. Vaporware, it's on their roadmap kind of thing. And that's usually the extent that the software itself doesn't match the requirements it has, is that there's functionality that was oversold and it never became part of the project because it took the software vendor too long to develop that along the way. But rarely, to your point, it's the nitty gritty. Let's look at the code. Let's look to see how they've logged what they're doing in the comments in a code stream. Rarely do we need to get to that level, because it's rarely that's the reason a system failed or an implementation failed.
I'm here with Scott Janke talking about lessons from ERP failures. We've got a lot more to cover, but first we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to get to some more questions here in just a moment. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control. Steve, we've chatted before, but remind me and our audience a little bit more about Epicor and where you're focused these days.
Hey, Eric, yep, good to talk to you, and thanks for asking. So Epicor, what we do is we make and sell cloud software for the global supply chain. And when I say that, when a customer purchases our software, we're committed to running their day-to-day business. And this would include everything from finance and procurement to production and sales. It's a responsibility we take very seriously, and it's something I believe we're very good at. We've got an employee base that has the deep expertise to understand their business and run their business. We also compete against 2 or 3 of the largest software companies in the world. So it's not good enough for our products to be good. They have to be consistently great, and that's a really important focus for me. So great products, deep industry expertise. We also focus on the essential workers that make those businesses run. We like to say Epicor's got you covered from the shop floor to the top floor. And when we say that, we really mean it. So that's Epicor.
It also suggests that you're not necessarily trying to be everything to everyone. You've got a pretty deliberate purpose and focus.
No, you're right. We really don't. So we focus on the make, move, and sell economy, which would really be manufacturing, distribution, and retail, like a retail operation. Well said. We don't try to be everything to everyone. We really do specialize and focus. And it is one of the secrets of our success. I guess it's not too secret anymore, but it's an area of focus for sure.
The last thing you want to have happen is for your digital transformation to end up in court. I've been doing this for 20 years and I have seen everything. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney focusing my practice on drafting and negotiating software-related contracts and litigating software disputes across the country. Feel free to reach out to us at taftlaw.com. We'd love to talk to you about the litigation process and what you can expect.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 169. My name is Eric Kimberling here with Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday and also past episodes of the show by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. I'm here with Scott Janke, and we're talking about lessons from ERP implementation failures. Fuad on LinkedIn says, what is the ideal number of people needed to operate per module? And then I'm going to sort of build on this one by one here. And then Darian asks, how many people does the company that's doing the project need to put on their project team? And then this is kind of a funny response / rhetorical question from Paul on LinkedIn, who's responding to Darian's question, saying, how long is a piece of string? So I get what Paul's saying. It's hard to answer the question with clarity, but I'll ask it anyway. Or maybe I'll sort of frame it a little bit differently, or instead of giving us a number of like, what's the magic number of people you need on a project to ensure you don't fail? That's not a realistic question, just because it depends on so many different variables: scope, size of the company, complexity, is it full-time or part-time, all that stuff. So we won't necessarily get into that exact number, but maybe to frame it a little bit differently, when you're looking at these cases, when we're analyzing these failures, how often is it related to the fact that the client themselves didn't have enough people supporting the project, or there's some sort of resourcing issue or input issue on the client side? How often does that happen?
Sometimes we would like to see clients in an active project have more full-time bodies on a project than a higher count, but less percentage associated with the project. So even in believe it or not, I think even a very large enterprise system doesn't require as many people as you think. Per work stream area, 3 to 5 is sufficient in many cases. But it's the amount of time the company is able to give those resources to the project. Because one of the things, and this is one of those areas where we see the client to blame, meaning the plaintiff or the organization funding the implementation, is that we require that the client, whether it's agile, waterfall, or some hybrid, actively agree and accept work product as it goes through the organization. So the need for approvals is quite high in an enterprise system. But when a lot of folks that are on the client side don't have the time to devote to the project, those approvals, those decision points get dragged out. And then you'll hear potentially the CIO or CFO tell the software implementer, stop dragging your feet, move forward. So then they get into a habit of saying, hey, I'm going to send over this piece of a document or this decision point for you. If I don't hear from you in a week or two, we're going to assume it's approved and we're going to move forward. That's a problem on all kinds of fronts. But many times the SI will do that because they're being forced to move forward and the client isn't providing the approvals on a timely basis. But the severity of those decisions still requires at some point for the project to pause until the client approves a major scope change or a different direction the project needs to take. So resources, it's more about full-time than total FTE count. And it's also being engrossed in the decision-making along the way. Do not defer to any software vendor or vendor in its basic form to make decisions on behalf of the client. If you start doing that, and then you realize the SI has gone down a wrong path, it's too late to say, I'm going to stop this project and sue you because you shouldn't have done that. Because we will ultimately find emails saying, hey, do what do you think is best? And that's a big problem.
That's a great point. You're sort of giving up, not your leverage necessarily, although you are giving up leverage in the future. If it gets to a lawsuit phase, you've sort of given, you've relegated blame, I guess, or you've taken on more blame at that point because you didn't, you didn't document what you needed or wanted. I'm going to get to a follow-up here question in just a second. But first I want to address this question from Ozzy on YouTube. Says, is this actually live? And I replied in the chat, yes, it is live. And if you'd like me to prove it further, if you'd like further evidence that this is live, ask another question and we'll answer it live here. How about that? Just to prove that we're live here today.
There you go.
But here's the real question I want to get to here. This is from Ganesh on LinkedIn. This is a super interesting question. I don't know that I've ever addressed this. I'm curious to see what you think, Scott. Ganesh says, traceability sounds good, but won't it lead to micromanaging and eventually a lack of trust? I've never heard of that question, but it's a great one. I really like that question. I'm curious to see what your thoughts are. How do you balance that, or how do you find that right balance?
Actually, I think it's the counter to that. The effort up front on the planning phase. And by the way, of all the most important phase of the project, kickoff, planning, config, design, test, train, deploy, planning is the most important aspect and most important phase of any project. Go slow to go fast. And in fact, we're doing a level set with a client right now, outside of an expert witness case, where we're kind of going backwards to clarify again, what's that definition of success? What are those ingredients that are going to be necessary to be in place for the system when it goes live to be successful? And so understanding that full scope of requirements to the level of, I can hand a book of requirements to a system integrator and they should have very few questions, right? Without that beginning phase or beginning starting point of traceability, you are going to require micromanaging along the way because there's not very little documentation at the beginning and very little documentation along the way. If I know what the scope is once we leave the planning phase, I have a pretty strong confidence the bulk of that, if not all of it, should be there when we're doing testing and training, right? So I actually think the more you document the fine points, the less you have to micromanage.
Yeah, it's a great point. And the more you ensure that you're all on the same page and you all have clarity of what it is you're trying to accomplish with the project, all that good stuff.
You brought up a question earlier, or somebody did, about resources. Let me address that as well. We see this frequently, not all the time, but frequently during expert witness case, where the defendant, the software vendor, the software system integrator will say, well, you had a number of executives leave the company, are sponsors of the project, and so that caused the problem, or you had a lot of turnover on your project staff. Our feedback to that is, if you have proper documentation along the way, it should be very easy to onboard somebody, what the original scope was, the project charter, what the requirements are, and where you are in the phases of the project. Using turnover as an excuse of, well, we had to re-educate folks and that caused a lot of delay in the project doesn't fly well, because I think the documentation and proving and tracking where you are on the project would cover any kind of issues that resource changes would happen. And quite honestly, on the flip side, we hear that quite often with the system integrator is, we have a problem with the project because the SI had a lot of turnover of staff.
Yeah.
Again, with proper documentation, the onboarding process should be very straightforward for them to get up to speed very fast. Without documentation, it's learning over the shadow and the shoulder of other individuals on the project. And that's the problem for a lot of clients.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and along these same lines, I was actually hoping this person was watching this live. This is from Marcus Harris, who is a attorney, by the way, and he, just as a side note, we've done work for him, and we've been a client of his in the past for cases he's been involved with. And he's a lawyer that specializes in contract-related issues as well as lawsuits like this. So if you're in the unfortunate situation of needing an attorney in a situation like this, he's a great guy to contact. But anyway, Marcus is watching in on YouTube, it looks like, and he asked the question, what documents are the most important to mitigating the risk of failure? For example, statements of work, project plans, et cetera. So is there a certain type of documentation that you think is the most important to have to sort of mitigate that risk?
Well, the statement of works are important just because that's a very heavy, influential, legal contract document, right? It tells about scope and assumptions, constraints, but most ERP or enterprise implementations take years, and there's quite a few change orders that are likely to happen. So that's more of a point in time. It's really getting into the design documents, the configuration documents, and the true set of requirements, whether that's in a tool like Jira or it's simply in an Excel spreadsheet or other tracking items. The design documents and the requirements are by far the biggest influences of what is going to be done on the project. But on top of that, most enterprise systems have change orders. It could be a schedule change, a scope, budget, or the like. When those changes take place, there are certain documents like design documents, like the requirements, that need to be refreshed frequently to accept that. I refer a lot of this to building a custom house or an office building, is that the original blueprints are not what the as-builts are at the end of it. And when you don't have updates that take place with even a few number of documents, like I mentioned, becomes a problem at the end, because if I was the CIO or COO or president, I want to know what that SOWs look like, what the change orders were, what those design docs and requirements were, should reflect what I'm getting at the end. But most people create project plans. Obviously, SOWs are a point in time. Things happen along the project, whether it's a change order or not, and nothing gets updated to reflect that. No meeting notes, no status reports, things like that. So at the end of the project, it's very hard to figure out how we got here. But it's really about I would say the architectural plans of a project are probably the most important, but they have to be in layman terms. The staff that the client is going to put on the project rarely are IT experts, and certainly are not in that system, because they wouldn't have hired an SI to do it in the first place. So it needs to be in very layman terms what is to be expected during the config and development phase.
I'm here, Scott Janke, talking about lessons from ERP failures. We've got a lot more to cover, but first we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to get to some more questions here in just a moment. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
Just tell me what you've got to say to me. I've been waiting for so long to hear.
I'm excited to share our newly released 2024 Digital Enterprise Operations Report. This free download is available on the Third Stage website at thirdstage-consulting.com. This report is truly packed full of technology-independent and agnostic insights for your project to ensure that you're strategically optimized for success. Download your copy today with the QR code in front of me, or visit our website for more details.
Hi, this is Eric Kimberling with Third Stage Consulting and your host of Transformation Ground Control. I want to encourage you to read our Guide to Organizational Change Management. It's a free report or free guide that we published. It's one that I actually wrote that talks about best practices and lessons learned as it relates to change management. So as you know, on this podcast, we cover a lot of stuff related to the human sides of change, organizational change management, including training, communications, org design, all kinds of stuff as it relates to change management. So if you're trying to learn more about change management, or you're looking for more direction and ideas on how to get started on your change management strategy and your overall journey, be sure to check out this guide. You can read it by scanning the QR code on the screen in front of you, or in the links below for this particular podcast episode. You can find a link to take you to the page that will allow you to register to go ahead and download that and read it for free. So be sure to check it out. It's the Guide to Organizational Change Management, written by yours truly. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think, and hope you enjoy the rest of this episode. Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 169. My name is Eric Kimberling, here with Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday, and also past episodes of the show by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. I'm here with Scott Janke, and we're talking about lessons from ERP implementation failures. And we're getting so many good questions from the audience here. It's actually hard to pick the best ones to focus on here. But here's one that I think you'll like, Scott, because you and I are both Big 4/Big 5 consulting guys previously in our lives. This is from Ozzy on YouTube. Ozzy asks, do you think Big 4 consulting is losing impact in the ERP consulting market? I feel like boutique firms have more selling value in the modern world of specialized tech offerings. I say this as a Big 4 guy. So curious, what are your thoughts? And maybe to add to that a little bit, is the size, are the Big 4 more likely to get themselves into legal issues or lawsuits related to these projects?
Well, that's two-pronged question there. I would agree with Ozzy's question that because of the selling point of more boutique firms that have great resources in them, like us, offer a better value, price to value than a lot of these consulting firms, these large big four. But I would say that those firms will almost always get the very large publicly facing company projects because the board, the C-suite almost require a firm of that scale and authority to win those projects. Most of those boutique firms, I think, still have a role in those large projects because we typically come in, firms like Third Stage come in as kind of the PMO, change control, change management experts. And that really works out well for the client because they get the scale and depth of a big four, but then also the uniqueness that we provide many times because of these expert witness cases where we can guide the project better than if it was just a client and a big four. But one thing that we call out often during our sales cycle to a large client going through a big ERP is that you like the name of a big four, but quite honestly, the staff that gets assigned to your project will change frequently throughout the duration of the project. And in many times they go out to the street and hire contractors to come under the umbrella of the big four and work on those projects. And again, one of the clients that we have today, that's the case. We asked for a roster of all the folks on the SI, and half of them have outside email addresses. So be leery about hiring a big four just to get the name, because most of the staff may be folks that will work for us one day. So it's be careful that you're never going to get the A players across the board on many of these projects if you hire a big four. And so we see that often in our expert witness cases where they put full faith in a big four implementer, but then they find out that staff turnover is so extraordinary, they don't even know who's on the project at any given time. That knowledge transfer tends to wane quite a bit. So be leery of that, but they will always be in the play for these big global public companies. That's not something that's going to go away, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. Agree. I totally agree with that. And what's interesting as you were talking, I was thinking of a follow-up question here that I'm going to ask in a moment, but I'm going to ask you a question here in a second about software vendors too. Is there a correlation between named software vendor and failure rates? But as you were answering that question, I was thinking about this question, asking you here in a second. I was thinking about how, this is really interesting for the audience that might find this interesting, is when you're an expert witness, whatever side you're on, whether you're the plaintiff or the defendant, the attorneys from the opposing side do anything they can to try to discredit you. And one of the things they do, which I actually kind of enjoy doing from an expert witness perspective, is they'll go read like every blog I've published, or they'll watch this video. For example, this video will get reviewed by an attorney on the opposing side of a case at some point in the future. I don't know when and where, but some attorney is going to watch this, and if when they watch this, hello, good to see you. My name's Eric. I'm on the other side. But the reason they do that is they'll watch this video. For example, they'll watch this interview with you and I, and they'll say, "Wait, hold on a second, Scott. You remember this video from 3 years ago when you said that big four consulting firms are, you said they are more likely to fail?" And of course, that's not what you said, but they'll try to make you try to twist your words because you just said that they hire people off the streets. I'm paraphrasing what you just said. And so what is interesting about that is that this, they go and they try to discredit any way they can to say that basically the side you're on, you've said something that actually supports the other side, and they try to discredit you in that way. So having said that, I'm just sharing that more of as an anecdotal or more of a general FYI for the audience. But when we look at software vendors, then you look at SAP and Oracle and Microsoft, a lot of the expert witness cases we've been involved with have involved SAP. I'd say, SAP has probably been the most common failure that we've seen in terms of expert witness work. And then Oracle and Microsoft are pretty common as well. And then, of course, we've done expert witness work for other or related to other software vendors as well. But do you see any sort of correlation with the name of the software vendor or, the technology being deployed? Do you see more common failures in one part of the market versus not?
Well, I'll say that humans are humans, right? There's personality conflicts, there's challenges with cultural backgrounds, experience, and just work-life balance. And so even if you and I were the ideal consultants for one client, we may not be for the other. And so in many cases, these software vendors, the ones that actually own the software, tend not to be great implementers because that's not their job. They're here to develop software, deploy software, update software. They rarely are the ones that are great in implementing their software because they tend to have fewer staff than necessary. And we get right back into swapping out resources on a project. But I would say that software platforms that have very structured internal processes of how data flows from one module to the other, the software vendors themselves, SAP as an example, tend to be very rigid in how they implement it as well. And so if you go to a third-party system integrator, they may tend to be more flexible in their thinking, whereas a lot of the software vendors like SAP, Oracle, and the bunch, even Salesforce to some extent, may be very rigid in how they go about engaging with the client and implementing in a live environment. And so much like the conversation we had with the big four versus boutique firms, some are much more agile in how they engage with the client, understand the scope, and conform and config going forward. I'll say something as well is that, and hopefully this doesn't come up on a future expert witness, very few ERP platforms can do 100% of everything a client wants to do. And so we talk about this a lot at Third Stage around fringe application, point solutions, best of breed, whatever you want to label, you want to call them, is that some of the big software vendors want to put all that functionality in their platform and potentially may require functionality changes that falls under the banner of customization. And so more boutique firms, third-party integrators may tend to look at other applications that fit those requirements better. And so it's a little bit of that rigidness that we see a lot when the SI is the software vendor themselves in not looking at other solutions to meet a client's needs. So either don't do that in the future because our system doesn't do it, or they'll go off on a customization trail that will get them in a world of trouble when it doesn't work in the larger ecosystem of a client's technology stack.
Right. Yeah, makes total sense. And you're right, that response will get quoted at some point in the future. An attorney's going to say, Scott, you just said that the vendor's fault, and that is not what you said, but they'll try.
It was a Tuesday. It's a Tuesday.
Right, exactly. Yeah, on Wednesday, it's a different story.
It's a different story.
Right. So this is from Fuad on LinkedIn. Fuad says, who needs to approve the change orders, and how important, maybe just to back up even more, how important are change orders during these sorts of cases?
Yeah, my preference for enterprise system implementations is to do as small of a phase and scope as possible, right? Do it often. Do it. Don't try and put everything in the kitchen sink in the first phase of a project, but plan out and let the client base know that you are already planning phase 2, phase 3. It's not getting thrown on a parking lot and we're not going to talk about it again. But change orders will almost always happen, as I mentioned earlier, on large, longer spanning projects. Tends to be scope changes because as you go through the configuration and design phase, you start realizing things that you didn't know about that you want the system to do differently than during the very beginning of the initial requirements gathering. But one of the things, going back to the planning phase, is, in my opinion, the most important phase, is we talk about escalation, status reporting, issues and risks, and how the governance model works on these projects. We'll answer that question for him on who signs a change order. Tends to be the scale and scope of it. So if it's something that will impact a single work stream that isn't material, those tend not to require a change order because there would have been some preconceived scaling that anything over $10,000 may require a change order. In some organization, it might be anything over 50 or 100,000 requires a change order. So it is different based upon the project. But once we get to formal change order that impacts scope and certainly has a budget impact, usually goes back to potentially whoever signed the SOW. whether it's the CIO, CFO, president. If it requires a change order based upon that project governance, it tends to need somebody senior, because part of the process of them signing is to educate them on what this is about. If it gets signed at a lower level, it tends to get ignored by the senior leadership because it never rises to their understanding. And then when they get a change order for $1 million, they want to know, how did we get here? And they were ignorant to the fact of how we got there. So at some point from a governance structure, having them be part of a steering committee escalation path that is also includes change orders will help educate the leadership, because you never want them to be out of the loop of where the project is running. And many times they are. They have no idea because they've trusted everyone to do their job. But the people that are doing their job don't know their authority and will make decisions without getting the leadership approval.
Yeah. And oftentimes, one way to view change orders is to view change orders as a potential symptom of something deeper. Usually there's a root cause behind why are we doing change orders. I mean, you think about the common reasons why. It's not as simple as saying, well, it's because we had to change the way the software was, or there's an assumption that changed. Those are real things. But usually if you dig even deeper, you find that one of two things is going on, or both. One is unrealistic expectations. We never had realistic expectations or realistic cost or realistic level of effort. So therefore, we need a change order now to realign expectations with reality. And the other potential root cause oftentimes is change orders is that the organization itself is resisting change. And to your point, if you allow lower level people in the organization to do change orders, a lot of times they're going to say, well, I don't like the way the software works because it doesn't look like my old system. So I want to change this software to look like my old system. Let's do a change order. And so you have to really, I totally agree with your point about project governance and executive visibility into change orders, because oftentimes if they are involved, first of all, a lot of times change orders won't happen as much just because people know that the executive teams approve it. So that's going to remove a certain number of them just because people don't want to, they know they're going to be told no, or they just don't want to raise it to that level. But in other cases, when there is a change order that survives that fear, the executives can look at that and say, well, what's going on here? To your point, why are we doing this? Why, do we have a realistic plan? Are we just resisting change? Is there a better way to do this other than doing a change order? So I think there's a lot of good that comes from executives reviewing.
And to follow up with that on some of our expert witness cases, when we get called in to a case like this, or a situation where there's frequent change orders, and often the change order scope of budget is exceedingly high. Let's say it's a $5 million implementation and every change order we're seeing is $1 million. That should raise all kinds of concerns in a live project. But when we look back, when the client signs those excessive change orders, it pretty much in many cases gives the approval that the project is okay and that the change orders are okay. So if you truly have a problem of how the project is progressing, but you're signing the change orders, as I mentioned, one party is rarely 100% at blame. That's a concern from us from a client plaintiff perspective, is they're doing a horrible job. It used to be 2 years and now it's 5 years and we still don't have a working system. If we come in as an expert witness and see that you signed a $1 million change order every year, that means you're giving credence that change order is valid and that the project needs to change according to that change order. So be careful as a client signing change orders, because you are giving approvals that you're progressing the way it should be progressing. And that rarely is the case if you have too many change orders.
I'm here with Scott Janke talking about lessons from ERP failures. We've got a lot more to cover, but first we're going to take a quick break and we're going to get to some more questions here in just a moment. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
My name is Eric Kimberling, and I'm the CEO and founder of Third Stage Consulting. Before we dive too far into today's content, I want to invite you to learn a little bit more about Third Stage Consulting, who we are and what we do. We help clients through their entire digital transformation life cycles, beginning with digital strategy, software evaluation and selection, all the way through and including implementation planning, implementation readiness, and the actual implementation itself. We're technology agnostic, so we only represent our clients' best interests. We do not represent software vendors. But having said that, we work very closely with software vendors, all the leading players that you can imagine we've worked with, both in helping clients evaluate and select them, but also in helping clients implement those solutions as well. So we have a very broad, objective, agnostic view of the market that is meant to really represent your interest as you go through your digital transformation. I also encourage you to scan this QR code right here to get access to our resource center. This resource center has a ton of information, a ton of ebooks that are free. You have access to top 10 software rankings, playbooks for how to make your project more successful, guides to change management, YouTube videos, all kinds of stuff that are going to help you through your digital transformation. So I encourage you to scan this QR code to get access to those resources. And please feel free to reach out to me directly to brainstorm ideas about your project. Even if it's just informally, you want to bounce around some ideas and get some informal advice, I'd be happy to spend some time with you. So feel free to reach out to me. I've included my contact information below. You can also find it in the description field of this video as well.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 169. My name is Eric Kimberling here with Darian Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday and also past episodes of this show by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. I'm here with Scott Janke, and we're talking about lessons from ERP implementation failures. Here's a really interesting question from Ozzy, and to be fair, this is probably a question that would be better for Marcus Harris, who is in the audience here today, the attorney I was telling you guys about. But we'll see if we can take a stab at this question here, Scott. This is from Ozzy on YouTube. Ozzy says, I'll stop asking questions, I swear. And please don't stop asking questions. These are really good questions. But Ozzy says, at what point does the consulting firm stop iterating the delivery to fulfill the SOW and decide to just take on the lawsuit? Or in other words, just get sued? You know, maybe help us explain, how does this, obviously lawsuits don't just happen overnight. It's not like one day an executive wakes up and says, you know what, I think I'm going to sue the vendor. Usually it's weeks and months and sometimes years of things culminating and percolating and building to the point where there's a failure. And oftentimes what happens too is the end client stops paying the vendor. A lot of times that's an interesting dynamic too, is they say, hey, this thing's not going well. We're just going to stop paying the vendor. And so what ends up happening in those cases is vendor gets sued and then vendor countersues because client didn't pay their bills. A lot of times, and that just sort of, in my opinion, that just sort of makes things messier and more confusing, because now you've got this economic thing, and that could be a reason why, vendor didn't fulfill their obligations or whatever. But in your opinion, though, Scott, or maybe not even in your opinion, just as a matter of fact, when we see these cases, how does that typically unfold with the software vendor? Do they at some point say, hey, just go ahead and sue us, we're done? Or how does that typically materialize?
Well, we are not attorneys.
Right.
And in our opinions that we write in our expert witness reports are from arm's reach of what we see as problems with project management alike. We tend to be told, and we don't like to add any kind of legal opinion at all. These people are in the fault because of this reason. We don't say those kind of things. Right. But if it gets to, so I don't want to sound like a broken record, but if you do the planning effort correctly, you'll know pretty soon whether there's a point in time where it's like, this is not going to work out. So it's either on the SI software vendor side that they overpromise software and all the requirements are no problem. But as they get into the project of how do I actually configure the system to do that, and the cadence and scale of the change order starts to increase, there should be a natural point where the entire project needs to pause, because there's obviously a disconnect between what you're able to deliver and what we want. Mm-hmm. On the flip side, from a software vendor standpoint, if you find the client along the way is becoming unreasonable in adding new requirements, saying, actually, that is in scope because that's what I meant in that requirement. If that frequency happens a lot, and when you're like, hey, this is truly out of scope, this is something we've never talked about, and they're like, no, it is. Very early on, you're going to see whether this is a partnership or not. And so they undersold the scale of the project just to get you started. I would like to believe that there's always a workable solution in a project, even if it's a point of we're going to reduce the scale tremendously, or the scope tremendously, to get you something of value and then part ways amicably. But it's very difficult because a lot of human emotions get into these litigation situations where neither one wants to put their sword down. And it usually gets longer in the implementation than it should in many of our expert witness cases, because no one wants to show fault or blame. And it kind of is a situation where we talk about hiring a boutique firm, even if you have a big four, is typically if you have a third party involved in the implementation, their job is to be able to be a referee and say, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I'm feeling. There's a problem. We need to pause before it gets to a litigation standpoint. If it's just the client and a software implementer, that tends to extend the problem too long, and it becomes a legal situation. But when's the exact moment that it feels like it's going? That's usually a situation awareness perspective, that you just have to see that this is not a partnership like we thought.
Right. Yeah, and Paul on LinkedIn has a great point that sort of adds to what you just said, Scott. Paul says nobody wants to sue anybody. It takes a lot, and many are settled out of court with the help of Marcus. And Marcus, of course, is Marcus Harris, who is in one of the audiences, if not both, either YouTube or LinkedIn. But if you look up Marcus Harris, he's someone that can help you from a legal perspective. But I think Paul brings up a good point that first of all, people don't want to be in lawsuits. It's not like companies are, for the most part, they're not overzealous and excited about suing. It's usually like a last resort. But, I think that's one thing. And secondly, one thing Paul alludes to that's really important to point out is most of these cases never get to court. So when I are hired to be prepared, we're ready to testify in court. But of the 50 or so cases that our team has been involved with, I'd say we've testified in maybe 3 or 4 of the 50. Either we've testified in court or we've testified in arbitration. 99% of the time it settles, out of court, because no one wants that publicity. It looks bad for the software vendors. It usually looks bad for the client as well. Their customers see that they had a failed ERP implementation. That does not look good for the end customer either. So I think both parties have an incentive to keep it out of court if they can. So I guess just to ask you more of an opinion-based thing here, Scott, which no matter how you answer this, some attorney someday is going to quote you on this and they'll use it against us, but I'll ask it anyway. But do you see the rate of failure increasing or decreasing or staying the same? What do you think is going to happen here with the future of ERP implementations and digital transformations?
I'd like to say that the amount of legal or expert witness cases that we may be called into will decline, because I think a lot of clients have more access to supporting resources, access to more information about how to control projects, what does entail before we go down this journey. So I'd like to believe that the amount of resources available to clients will allow them to stay out of trouble. But can't necessarily say that without smiling and saying that human nature is human nature. We will tend to go down the shortest and easiest path, and that sheer capability of us to skirt the difficult conversations, the difficult work about prepping an organization before going through an implementation. I think we're going to see that they're probably going to be status quo, just because as people ebb and flow in the organization and the economy is changing, the external environment is changing quite rapidly. There's going to be the ability to shortcut the right methodology of a project. And that's just going to have a tendency of repeating history. And so I'd like to say that it would go down, but I think it's going to be probably status quo.
Yeah, I agree with you. And you mentioned something that's really important that we could actually spend a whole nother podcast on, and maybe we will spend a whole nother podcast interview on this someday. But the human behavior and the human flaws, that comes into play here, and it creates these organizational decisions that lead to the same failures over and over, regardless of how great technology is or how much technology advances. We as humans tend to make the same mistakes. And one of the biggest ones is we as humans, you look at a project and you look at all these different line items and the money you're spending. And for some reason, we as humans gravitate to the technology because I can see it. I've got my phone right here. It's physical. I can see the software, but I can't see the change management. I can't see the behavioral stuff. I can't see the operational efficiency or inefficiency. I can't see any of that, but I can see the technology. So I'm going to focus all my effort on deploying this technology, building it, testing it, all that stuff. And then we as humans just put the blinders on unintentionally in most cases, focus on the technology, and we don't think about all the other stuff that's more likely to make or break the project. So I think you're right. That right there is the gravity that I think is going to largely keep organizations in the status quo.
And I'll add, probably closing out on this, is that it's important also to note that go live is not the end of your transformation. And we focus so much on these multi-year, multi-million-dollar implementations, but that's just the beginning, right? The organization needs to accept it and adopt it. That's actually what my dissertation was on, and it's proven that an organization that embraces the people side of transformation will have a higher likelihood of success of the use of technology and process changes. It just goes hand in hand, but the go live is just one phase of a transformation. You can't just simply blame it on the technology. There's the people element, as you mentioned, but also just how the organization embraces change as well. If you feel like the ERP implementation is a forced effort because a legacy system is going off support, that's probably a wrong attitude to have at the very beginning. It's about leveraging that ERP implementation for change itself.
Yeah. Great. And well said. And I was hoping you would say that ChatGPT and some of these other tools are going to make things easier for us and solve all the world's problems, but that is not what you're saying from what I'm interpreting here.
Nope.
So I guess just to close out the conversation, this has been a great conversation, but just to wrap things up and to summarize, what are some of the best things that organizations and project teams can do to keep their projects out of trouble and also out of court?
I would say understand what you're getting into at the beginning. Understanding why you're doing something and what the expectation is at the end. One of the agile mindset is, when are we done, right? When is this thing finished? And so making sure that you have a clear end goal at the very beginning is so important. If you're just saying, I want to replace the system that we have, it's rarely enough just to say that. What is the definition of success at the end?
Right. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, that's your organizational definition of success versus failure. Yep. And that's what's going to determine whether or not you end up in court in many cases. If you think it's a failure, you're more likely to end up in court. Great conversation. Thank you again, Scott. That was super interesting, and I love the audience questions we had as well. So we're going to build on some of the topics that we just discussed here in just a moment. But first, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
Could you whisper in my ear?
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology-agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Steve, we've chatted before, but remind me and our audience a little bit more about Epicor and where you're focused these days.
Hey, Eric, yep, good to talk to you, and thanks for asking. So Epicor, what we do is we make and sell cloud software for the global supply chain. And when I say that, when a customer purchases our software, we're committed to running their day-to-day business. And this would include everything from finance and procurement to production and sales. It's a responsibility we take very seriously, and it's something I believe we're very good at. We've got an employee base that has the deep expertise to understand their business and run their business. We also compete against 2 or 3 of the largest software companies in the world. So it's not good enough for our products to be good. They have to be consistently great, and that's a really important focus for me. So great products, deep industry expertise. We also focus on the essential workers that make those businesses run. We like to say Epicor's got you covered from the shop floor to the top floor. And when we say that, we really mean it. So that's Epicor.
Your annual Insights User Conference is just around the corner, the Epicor Insights Conference. What are you looking forward to there, and what could we expect to hear about at this conference?
The big thing for me is that we get a lot of what I would call quality time with our customers. And when I say quality time, I mean good old-fashioned, face-to-face, in the same place at the same time, experience with the customers where they tell you what they really think. And in the case of Epicor, we get a lot of great feedback around applications, features, technologies that they love. And in some cases, where we've fallen short. I can tell you that when I think about some of the big projects we've done in the last 7 years that have made the biggest impact on both improving the customer experience, this would include everything from Profit 21 and Eclipse, which are distribution products, to Kinetic, which is for manufacturing, to our catalog, which is for automobiles. The feedback that has come directly from our customers at the Insights Conference has had the biggest impact on me. And in many cases, it's resulted in the biggest budgetary decisions I've made to fund projects. So I really appreciate the direct feedback we get. It isn't always fun. It can be a little bumpy, but customers know what they want, and our customers are very deep into their industries. So it's a level of information and intelligence we couldn't get any other way. I always look forward to that. That's the highlight for me.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 169. My name is Eric Kimberling, here with Darian Chwialkowski. We're both with Third Stage Consulting, which is an independent consulting firm that helps clients with digital transformations throughout the world. And you can find new episodes of the show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. So, Darian, we just had Scott on the show, obviously. Great conversation, interesting conversation with great questions from the audience about lessons from failures. What were some of your thoughts and takeaways from the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I just think there's a lot to unpack in expert witness. I think every case is just like slightly different, but obviously there's overall things that you can take away from what expert witnesses do and how companies can maybe avoid having to even get to that point. So I thought the conversation overall was super interesting from that perspective. I think one thing that really stood out to me kind of towards the end of the conversation actually is what Scott was saying about once go live happens, that's not the end of your implementation. Now you have to really put it to use in your whole company and actually make sure that it's working correctly. One question I had from that, and I know it was towards the end, so we didn't really have time to kind of dive into that a little bit more, is what happens when, if a company starts implementing it and it stops working, like it doesn't work, I guess you could say, exactly how they thought it would. What do they do at that point?
Well, I think the thing you really need to do is make sure that you have safeguards in place and controls in place to catch that, because there are going to be situations, either big or small or both, where the software doesn't do what you thought it would do or doesn't work exactly how you want it to, just because obviously it wasn't built specifically for your organization, there's going to be disconnects there. So the key is to build steps in your methodology and your process to ensure that you have the safeguards in place. And it starts with the business requirements, which we talked about with Scott. Making sure you have clear documentation around what it is you expect the software to do, and sort of the those requirements that you manage to throughout the implementation. So it starts there, but then even beyond that, when you start to get into like the testing phases, testing isn't just about making sure the technology works from a technical perspective. It's more importantly focused on, or should focus on, user acceptance testing and making sure that the business can accept and use the software, because those are oftentimes two different things, and that's usually where the disconnect is. Yes, the software works, quote unquote works, but it's not working for the business. And so you have to make sure it works for the business. And so generally you're going to see it pretty quick. If you have user acceptance testing and documentation built out, you're going to see it pretty quick, but those should be fairly limited. You shouldn't be exposing like massive disconnects with the way the software is working versus what you've documented in your requirements. If you do, then your system integrator is demonstrating a certain amount of incompetence that you've got to question there if they've built something that does not align with what you've documented and aligned on and agreed upon. So now, assuming the system integrator does their job right, and assuming you have documented your business requirements clearly, and you've used that as a sort of a guide to how the software is being built and deployed, then the disconnects should be fairly minimal. They'll still happen, but it shouldn't be as massive as it might otherwise be. So that'd be my take, is just build steps in the process throughout your methodology. And that's part of what we do as a company in our team, is we help clients make sure that they've got those safeguards in place and those steps in the process to ensure that it doesn't get to that point.
Right. So then by the time that it is actually live and implementing, hopefully you don't have those issues arise, I guess you could say.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, super interesting. And I know that you said this to Scott too, but it'd be really cool to have him back on to hear more about his PhD work that he did, and kind of dive into that a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. He's got such a unique combination that a lot of us don't have, both the academic side of research-based knowledge and understanding of technology and digital transformation, but also obviously the hands-on experience consulting to clients like we do as well. So it's a pretty unique combination. That's why he's such a great guest to have on the show, and a great person to have on our team as well. So we're gonna keep going with this thread though, and shift gears a little bit. It's very much related to this topic of failure, but we're gonna shift gears and talk about just what are those little things that can happen during a project that are caused or resulting from both software vendor / implementer and the implementing organization. What are those mistakes that happen? And also, I want to get into, in this video we're going to play you, I get into sort of the blame that typically happens. There's a lot of finger pointing that happens and leads up to the failures that Scott and I just talked about. So we're going to talk about what some of those finger pointing components are and what the realities of them are, and just to make people aware so they can hopefully avoid and know how to deal with those sorts of issues when they come up. So we're going to take a quick break, and we'll come back. We'll talk about the digital transformation blame game. So stay tuned. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
My name is Eric Kimberling, and I'm the CEO and founder of Third Stage Consulting. Before we dive too far into today's content, I want to invite you to learn a little bit more about Third Stage Consulting, who we are and what we do. We help clients through their entire digital transformation life cycles, beginning with digital strategy, software evaluation and selection, all the way through and including implementation planning, implementation readiness, and the actual implementation itself. We're technology agnostic, so we only represent our clients' best interests. We do not represent software vendors. But having said that, we work very closely with software vendors, all the leading players that you can imagine we've worked with, both in helping clients evaluate and select them, but also in helping clients implement those solutions as well. So we have a very broad, objective, agnostic view of the market that is meant to really represent your interest as you go through your digital transformation. I also encourage you to scan this QR code right here to get access to our resource center. This resource center has a ton of information, ton of ebooks that are free. You have access to top 10 software rankings, playbooks for how to make your project more successful, guides to change management, YouTube videos, all kinds of stuff that are going to help you through your digital transformation. So I encourage you to scan this QR code to get access to those resources. And please feel free to reach out to me directly to brainstorm ideas about your project. Even if it's just informally, you want to bounce around some ideas and get some informal advice, I'd be happy to spend some time with you. So feel free to reach out to me. I've included my contact information below. You can also find it in the description field of this video as well.
The last thing you want to have happen is for your digital transformation to end up in court. I've been doing this for 20 years and I have seen everything. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney focusing my practice on drafting and negotiating software-related contracts and litigating software disputes across the country. Feel free to reach out to us at taftlaw.com. We'd love to talk to you about the litigation process and what you can expect.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 169. This is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Darian and Chwialkowski. We're both with Third Stage Consulting. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. And we're going to play you a clip from my YouTube channel. This is a video called The Digital Transformation Blame Game. And in this video, I start to talk about, what are some of the sources of blame and the finger pointing that happens in a digital transformation. And I try to maybe expose some of the myths or some of the misconceptions around blame and whose fault it really is during a project. And most importantly, just recognize that, first of all, there's a lot of blame that goes around when there's trouble on a project. And secondly, maybe even more importantly, there's a lot you can do to avoid some of these challenges and some of these areas of blame that commonly come up in these projects. So let's roll the clip here of the digital transformation blame game, and then we'll come back and talk about it.
It's definitely the implementer's fault. No, it's actually the project manager's fault. The customer just refuses to change. The software doesn't work. That's not a problem with this system. It's a third-party system that's the problem. But what are the real sources of blame and whose fault is it? That's what I'm going to talk about here today. Oftentimes you see a lot of finger pointing that goes around, a lot of blame. There's a blame game that goes around where you have the customer blaming the implementer blaming the customer. Maybe both parties are blaming the software vendor. And it becomes hard to decipher whose fault is it really. And so what I want to do today is unpack and demystify some of these common factors and these common themes of blame and really talk about what it means to your digital transformation to ensure that you understand not only that there's a lot of blame to go around, but also understand what some of the sources of the challenges are during digital transformations. Before we dive too far into today's content, I want to invite you to learn a little bit more about Third Stage Consulting, who we are and what we do. I've included a link to a video right here that describes Third Stage in a bit more detail. It talks about our story, our history, our philosophy, our clients, our service offerings, and that sort of thing. But in general, what Third Stage Consulting does is we're an independent and tech-agnostic consulting provider. We help clients through their entire digital transformation life cycles, beginning with digital strategy, software evaluation and selection, all the way through and including implementation planning, implementation readiness, and the actual implementation itself. We're technology agnostic, so we only represent our clients' best interests. We do not represent software vendors. But having said that, we work very closely with software vendors, all the leading players that you can imagine we've worked with, both in helping clients evaluate and select them, but also in helping clients implement those solutions as well. So we have a very broad, objective, agnostic view of the market that is meant to really represent your interest as you go through your digital transformation. I also encourage you to scan this QR code right here to get access to our resource center. This resource center has a ton of information, a ton of ebooks that are free. You have access to top 10 software rankings, playbooks for how to make your project more successful, guides to change management, YouTube videos, all kinds of stuff that are going to help you through your digital transformation. So I encourage you to scan this QR code to get access to those resources. And please feel free to reach out to me directly to brainstorm ideas about your project. Even if it's just informally, you want to bounce around some ideas and get some informal advice, I'd be happy to spend some time with you. So feel free to reach out to me. I've included my contact information below. You can also find it in the description field of this video as well. One of the most common excuses for a digital transformation failure or troubled project is that the customer oftentimes will blame the implementer. And oftentimes the software vendor, if they're not the implementer, will also blame the implementer. So it becomes very easy to point the blame at the implementer if a project fails. After all, the implementer is the expert. They're the ones that know the software better than anyone. They're the ones that put together the plan. They're the ones that gave you the proposal on how the transformation is going to work. But the reality is it's a little bit more nuanced than that. It's not as simple as saying that the implementer is 100% at fault. Chances are fairly high that they might be partially at fault, but there might be something that you as an implementing organization are doing to contribute to that fault and to the failure points that go along with that. For example, oftentimes implementers will assume the best. Their assumptions behind their proposal and their project plan assume that everything is going to fall into place, that you're going to have a full-time dedicated team, that you're just going to defer to the way the software works. You're going to change your business processes to fit the software. You're going to go ahead and execute the train the trainer to get people trained quickly. You're going to do testing on your own. You're going to do data migration on your own without any hiccups. And if you assume all these things are true, which by the way is very unrealistic, but if you assume it's true, then yes, maybe the implementer can implement in the time frame and budget that they've indicated. However, more often than not, those assumptions are flawed. There's something wrong with the assumptions, and there's not a lot of rationalization or validation of the assumptions behind what the implementer is doing. So really, the implementer's involvement, you want to start questioning and start challenging and managing early on during the sales cycle when they first give you their proposal. And certainly as the project continues, you want to make sure you provide oversight and are managing the implementer rather than the implementer managing you, or worse yet, rather than assuming that you can just delegate everything to the implementer and they're just going to handle the implementation for you. There's a heavy involvement that the implementing organization needs to have in the project. They need to roll up their sleeves and be on equal footing with the implementation partner. So it's easy to blame the implementer, but there's usually a lot more blame to go around than just pointing the finger at the implementer during a digital transformation. There's two people that typically have a huge bullseye on them when a project starts to fail. One is the CIO at the executive level. Second is the project manager. The project manager, the person that's responsible for the day-to-day aspects of the project, is oftentimes on the hot seat when the project struggles, even if the project manager can't control some of the reasons why the project is failing. For example, if the implementation partner doesn't have the right resources on a project or refuses to provide the competencies needed to make the project successful, the project manager, who's usually an internal resource, will oftentimes get blamed for that. Another example is if the executive team within the organization haven't clearly defined what the general direction of the project is and make some of the key decisions to support the project and give the team clarity on how to execute the digital transformation, project manager again will get blamed for that if the project team isn't aligned or doesn't read the minds of the executive team to understand what it is that they want from the digital transformation. So again, it's really easy to look at a project manager and say it must be his or her fault because they're the ones that are in charge of this project. But the reality is there's a lot of complexities and nuances that go into this. So it's important to look at what the real root cause of blame is. And certainly if you have a project manager who isn't putting project governance and controls in place, isn't keeping an eye on all the details of the project, it could be their fault. But typically that's not the only reason why projects fail or why project managers get blamed. Oftentimes project managers get blamed for some of the other reasons that I mentioned, among others, that project managers oftentimes don't have control over. One of my pet peeves as a consultant in the digital transformation space is when I hear a software vendor or an implementation partner blame the customer because they refuse to change. They seem to have a sort of holier-than-thou perspective of their own software to believe that the software is perfect. The way the software works is the way the customer should run their business. And the reality is every customer is different. Every customer has a different strategy, has different operational strengths and weaknesses, has different sources of competitive advantage. And it's unrealistic to expect that at best. And at worst, it's highly arrogant for a software vendor or implementation partner to think that their software is a silver bullet or best practice. So what oftentimes happens is the vendor and or technical implementation partner will blame the customer when the software doesn't fit the business. Now, to be clear, sometimes that is a problem. Sometimes a customer just refuses to change their processes or they resist change when the processes that the software has baked into it would work perfectly fine for the organization. But there's quite a large amount of situations with any given transformation where the software just doesn't fit well what the customer needs. And that's okay. No one system is going to provide all the needs of every single customer. The key here is being realistic about it and saying, okay, this software gives us 80 or 90% of what we need. Now we need to figure out what to do with that other 10 or 20%. And that other 10 or 20%, by the way, is usually what causes the delays, the project overruns, and all that other stuff. So rather than blaming a customer and saying that it's their fault because they won't change, they won't just use the software out of the box the way it was built, it's important to look at and understand before you get into the implementation what those gaps are so you can figure out how you're going to mitigate that risk. One of the most common phrases we hear, especially during a lawsuit failure, is a customer that says the software doesn't work. It doesn't work, there's bugs in it, the data won't flow. the customization doesn't work, the code we developed doesn't work, we can't get the reports we need out of it. And again, it's not as simple as saying the software doesn't work, because oftentimes the software does work, but the customer sometimes will do things to the software to make it not work. For example, if you customize a system, chances are pretty high you're going to break it at some point, and that could cause the software not to work. Question becomes, is that the vendor's fault that the customer changed the software? That's open to interpretation, I suppose. Another way this blame seems to percolate into a project is what I mentioned before around the software not meeting all the needs of an organization. When the software doesn't meet the needs of the organization, it might work per se, but it's not working to meet the needs of the business necessarily, and that's a challenge. And then the third thing is if an employee within an organization isn't used to the software and it doesn't do things the way they're used to things working in their old system, they're oftentimes going to blame the new technology and say the software doesn't work. Not because it doesn't work technically, but because it doesn't work the way the old system works. So it's one thing to blame someone for the software not working, but it's really important to look at all the different nuances and the layers within that part of the blame game. Now, another component of the blame game is when your software vendor doesn't take responsibility for a failure or a breakage point within their technology, but instead they blame a third-party bolt-on system. So if you've got a legacy system, for example, that you need to have for regulatory purposes or because your core system won't handle the functionality needed, you're going to have a third-party bolt-on, and you're going to have to figure out how to integrate those systems. Now, oftentimes the integration doesn't work, the data doesn't map out correctly between the two systems, and it can create some challenges along the way. Oftentimes we see it time and time again, the software vendor and the technical implementation partners will wash their hands clean and say, that's not our problem, that's the third party's system's fault. Now, sometimes that's true. Sometimes there is a flaw or just a difference between the two systems. The architecture could be different. The databases could be different. There's a whole bunch of reasons why two systems might not work well together. But it's somewhat of a cop-out for a software vendor to say it's not our fault, not our problem, talk to the other vendor. Other vendor, by the way, will oftentimes say it's not our system that's a problem, it's that system that you're putting in right now that's the problem. And then you as a customer get stuck in the middle trying to figure out what in the world's going on. So it's important to recognize that this is a common part of the blame game, and you have to be prepared for it and have the technical competencies to really dig into it, to not assign blame appropriately, but more importantly, to figure out what the root cause of the problem is so that you can ultimately solve it. So these components of blame are things to be aware of. It's something that we commonly hear during projects, especially when times get tough, when the project gets distressed, and if a project is failing or has already failed, you'll see plenty of blame going around. But again, pointing blame in a black or white binary way is generally not effective, and it's not accurate in most cases. So it's important to understand the different nuances of where the blame lies and how the blame starts. Again, not to get the blame right, but so you can get to the root causes of how to fix the problem so there's no one to blame anymore.
So that's a clip from my YouTube channel where I talk about the digital transformation blame game. What were some of your thoughts or follow-ups from that video, Darian?
Yeah, I think it definitely relates to this topic of expert witness and what we talked about with Scott, but it also then dives into, like, beforehand, who is blaming who and who is really at fault for what in these situations. One thing you mentioned was the importance of challenging assumptions made by implementers early on in the project. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on specific strategies for effective managing of implementers in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the bigger the project, obviously, the more that's at stake with your implementer. The more bodies and hours and people you're throwing at the project. So there's more at stake to really ask the questions of what exactly are different people doing? Do you need all the people on the project right now? What happens a lot of times, if you think about it, if you're a system integrator, you're an implementer, and you make your money off services and implementation services, it's inevitable that there's going to be a lot of bodies thrown at the project that you don't necessarily know what they're doing. And so you just have to ask questions and have transparency into what they're doing and make sure that it's validated, because it's in their best interest to put more bodies on the project. It may not be in your best interest to put more bodies on the project because it's going to cost you more money. The other thing you have to be really aware of is a lot of times software vendors and system integrators try to compress the timeline. So they might say, hey, we can do this full implementation in, say, 18 months. And we're going to put X number of people on that project to get it done in 18 months. Well, the problem is if 18 months is not realistic, it's never going to get done in 18 months. It's going to be more like 24 or 30 or 36 months. the vendor isn't just going to say, oh, okay, well, we staffed it up really heavy in those first 18 months, but now that's taking us longer, we'll scale back and, we'll end up at the same cost. You're going to end up paying exponentially more because now you've got a higher run rate that's running for longer. And so that's one of the things you have to do too, is really challenge the duration. Because if you challenge the duration and say, hey, we're not going to do this in 18 months, there's no way, it's more like a 30-month project, let's just say, then you need your service provider to downsize or right size the proposal and the run rate so that it's a lower run rate for a longer period of time, rather than just assuming we're going to throw the same number of bodies at it for a longer period because they're going to make more money off that. So it's just that sort of project management and governance that you need to have in place, and really just not only to cut costs and make sure that you're spending effectively, but also just so you know what's going on, so you can be more of an active participant in managing all the work that's going on in a project like this.
Yeah, and I think when you know what's going on, you're able to then hold your vendors more accountable for whatever they're promising they can deliver. And I feel like that can also create more of a collaborative relationship throughout the project lifecycle.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. And it's not only more collaborative, but it's you just taking more ownership and not deferring or delegating or outsourcing too much of the project. You need the expertise, but you still have to have ownership of the project. And collaborative is a good word to describe that.
Right, yeah. Well, what a great conversation today, from the expert witness to then going to the blame game and seeing other sides of it. I think that was all super interesting to dive into.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a great conversation. And, of course, we're going to have other guests that are great guests as well. So in addition to Scott, who you got to hear from today, we have other guests coming up here in upcoming episodes. We're going to have another doctor next week, Dr. Hans Molnar, who's going to be on talking about insights from 100,000 different case studies. He's actually documented over 100,000 case studies over the last 30 years. And we're going to talk about some of the lessons and insights from those ERP implementations and digital transformations. In coming weeks, we're going to cover a lot of different topics, ranging from intro to smart factories, industry 4.0. We're going to talk about change leadership, platform as a service, supply chain management, a best of episode coming up over the summer. So we've got a lot of different guests coming up, a lot of big names in the industry that are going to be on the show here in the coming weeks. So be sure to check us out every Wednesday. You can see every episode at transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can also see the past episodes that you might have missed by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. The show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting and produced by Major Tom Productions. So thank you for being here today. Thank you to the audience for being here. And thank you, Darian, for another great episode. So we'll see you next week on Transformation Ground Control. Have a great week in the meantime, and we'll see you next week. Take care. Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control 100 and expert witness. Let me say that again. Let me just do this whole reintro.
Including fraudulent and illegitimate. Oh my God. Cannot speak today.
Let me learn how to talk first. My name is Eric Kimberling. I cannot speak.